Okay, so a chaid géal tá fáilte war ro over fad hiag amach na híthe nacht, the hud féle na carige fihe hían. Táid inta tóga go ma dabalte féle bheith a ggéanam léana na neart amachtaí ar sa fearhéal agus go féréal chumhaid. Agus mar chuidtain éile am léana be áhar a léachta an almosta Harry Holland bonithe ar híhir agus ar áhar de hud antálaí Denis O'Hearn. So a chaid géal, you're all very welcome to tonight's event as part of Feel na Carga Fihian. We're delighted this year to be able to deliver our events both in person and virtually. And tonight, as part of the festival's annual honorary lecture dedicated to Harry Holland, we are also delighted to have Professor Denis O'Hearn with us. So Denis is currently the Professor of Sociology and Anthropology in the University of Texas at El Paso. He has also worked as a Professor of Sociology in Binghamton University, New York, and also as Professor of Economic and Social Change here in Queen's University in Belfast from 2002 to 2006. Denis is celebrated for his published work on the biography of hunger striker Bobby Sands and other works in the fields of political economy, isolated imprisonment, and Ireland itself. So tonight we also have with us Dr. Fergal McCumnerty, the Director of Clonamona, who will be finding out more about Denis's works, experiences and interests regarding Bobby Sands and the Zapatistas. So at this point, before I hand over to Fergal and Denis, could I please ask you all to mute your microphones? And if we could save questions to the end of the session, I will open up the floor, or the screen rather, to allow for a Q&A session at the end. So, Mila Maiga Bacharja, and over to you, Fergal and Denis.
Mila Maiga, Orla. Agus gur mai over father's hat and Sean Ag. It's great to have you on. As I said, we hope to have Denis in the near future in person. That would be something that we could look forward to. So listen, it's great to have Denis here. I was speaking to Fleur about this during the week. It's been a long time. It's been a long time. Denis, from what we've been speaking with you, as many people here will know, for a long time, Denis was a native of West Belfast and also a neighbour of Harry Holland's. So to follow your road and Shaw again is.
Well, good to Fergal and also Orla, and thanks very much for inviting me here. I'm really honored to be doing this. I mean, as soon as you asked me, I think you asked me about 2 or 3 weeks ago if I would do this, and you know, I was immediately wanting to say yes because, you know, I remember Harry so well, and he was a great neighbor. They lived 3 doors down from us. I think I was living in Norfolk Drive for about 10 years, and basically ran into Harry, you know, most every day. And you know, with his gruff voice, he would greet me and want to talk about one thing or another. Or, you know, we'd, you know, I lost him a few times at a pub quiz up in Gravediggers and so on. So Harry was really somebody who was very important to me. Just real quickly, you know, when I heard about the tragic murder of Harry, I was in Japan with my daughter, Sinead, my eldest daughter. And I still remember very well the phone call from my younger daughter, Katrina. And, you know, she just said, Daddy, you know, something terrible has happened. And I couldn't have imagined that this would have been what it was. You know, and of course, you know, later on, you know, seeing Pauline and the girls, you know, it was a really sad time. But it was a time to remember, and in a funny way, because I was in Japan during it all. When I came back, it's like Harry never left, you know. I don't know if people would understand that, but to me, Harry is still kind of wandering around the streets of West Belfast, and I think maybe a lot of other people feel that way too, because he was such a fixture. But I do want to say also hello to the family, to Pauline, you know, and to the girls, or they're no longer girls, but they were back when I knew them: Sarah, Grania, Maeve, and Gail. And also to the Holland family. I mean, I was always very close with Geraldine and Brendan, and of course Tish, who we all remember. So it's really nice to be involved in this event. If I could just say one thing before I start, which is important to us here where I am. As you know, I'm in Paso del Norte, which is basically stuck in a little corner between Texas, Mexico, and New Mexico. And we like to make an acknowledgement whenever we do any events from here. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming here from unceded Indigenous land. I want to recognize and pay respects to the Indigenous people with long ties to this region where I'm in, the Lipan Apache, the Mescalero Apache, Piro, Manso, Suma, Humano, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, the Piro Manso Tiwa Indian tribe of the Pueblo of San Juan de Guadalupe, and the Tortugas Pueblo. And I also want to acknowledge the nations whose territories include present-day Texas, the Carrizo, Camacrudo, Coahuiltecan, Caddo, Tocawa, Comanche, Alabama, Coushatta, Kickapoo, and the peoples of Chihuahua and northern Mexico, from where many of our people here in Paso del Norte come, such as Raramuri, Tepehuan, Huixarica, and Nahuatlaca peoples. We want to recognize all of those communities and the things that they have done for us. And I look forward to the day when the lands and rights of these people will be restored to the Indigenous people, and when the lands of the Indigenous people of the world will be restored. And when settlers in particular will recognize the genocide on which so many nations have been established. And I suppose that goes for the Irish too. So I just wanted to say that before we start.
Dennis, I'm sure everyone on the call would echo the sentiments there. I suppose, Dennis, before we get into the main topics of the night, for anybody who doesn't know you, I wanted to maybe start off by just asking a wee bit about your background, about where you grew up and where you're from. If you can give us just a wee bit about your own backstory, if you don't mind.
I can remember a number of times being stopped by Brits on the streets of the North, and them asking where are you from, and I would say New Mexico, and they would say what, and it was kind of that was always a matter of some joy. And on one time I remember being in Derry, and they said, what are you doing here? And the people I was with said, well, we asked him here, but we didn't ask you here. So that was kind of my background there. I came in the late 70s. I was born and raised in Carlsbad in New Mexico. My grandmother on my father's side is Unangan. It's a Native Alaskan people, and I've been doing research lately on their history. They were basically enslaved to kill hundreds of thousands of fur seals to provide the people of China first, and then later on the people of Europe with luxurious fur coats, and went through a really terrible time. And so I'm learning a lot about what that side of my family went through. But the other side of my family was Irish, and I was always kind of brought up to be, aware of what was going on in Ireland. And when I went to university, then got an opportunity to come, and that was in the late 1970s, and kind of stayed ever since, or went back and forth between the US and Ireland. So for a long time, as you say, I was pretty much a native.
And what struck you when you landed in Belfast? Because I'm obviously interested to find out about your own, suppose, personal, political, ideological development, and how that came about and how that was shaped by your personal experiences. So when you came here in the 70s, we're obviously coming into the war zone. How did that impact on you? I don't know your.
No, I mean, I had kind of studied as much as I could about it, and I knew people from Belfast and from the North, and had learned quite a lot about the place before I came. But of course, nothing is ever quite like you expect it to be. One thing I've found over the years is that everywhere you go is always a lot bigger than you think it's going to be. I mean, you look at pictures and maps and things like that, and so getting to learn, Belfast, getting to learn Ireland, the island of Ireland, and so on, it was always a much bigger place than I had in my imagination. Within a week, I think, of coming, I went to a commemorative march. It was a commemoration of the March to Derry, and met a number of people, and that was really an interesting and important way to get to know the North. And I got to know a lot of people who have been friends ever since by going on that march. And I think the thing that was perhaps hardest to really get an understanding of the subtleties, of course, was the political situation. And especially the differences between different, factions that were involved in the struggle on one side or the other. And particularly at that time, the official IRA was still, well, not the IRA so much, but official Sinn Féin was still, fairly active. And so, managing those kinds of differences and figuring out exactly what they were all about was something that I found both interesting and important. And then the other thing that was going on at the time was the blanket protests. I kind of arrived right in the middle of that, or right before it. And, that was something that really came as a shock to see the intensity and to hear about the things that were going on in there. And I think, that was the same probably for the people there, because a lot of people really didn't know what was happening in the prison until the word kind of started to leak out, and particularly through Bobby's writings and through other people who were writing about it, who then let people know what was going on.
In terms of your own academic work, Dennis, I'm assuming then, I think you went back then to the States in Michigan. I think you did your research. You ended up receiving a PhD there. So what was your academic interest, and how did that overlap with your activist views that were developing at that time?
Yeah, that's a bit of a funny story, because, I think that the hunger strike period was just so intense, and I was mostly in Ireland during that, and went to a number of the funerals, and was there on the marches and everything else that was happening at the time. And to me, that was such a really intense time that I didn't feel that I could even do work on that. I think a lot of us would have felt that way who went through that period, that basically it was just such an intense period that if you really examined it too closely, you would just fall apart, basically. It was too much. And so what I did when I went back is I was very interested in the Irish economy. And I actually did my doctorate then on research. And since then, for about 10 years, most of what I worked on was the Southern Irish economy, the so-called Celtic Tiger. And, I was one of the few people who was actually critical of the Celtic Tiger, who saw it as...
You had predicted it's the maize, hadn't you, Dennis?
Sorry?
You had predicted it's the maize long before...
Well, its demise, or maybe a better way to put it, was that just it was not going to produce the kind of, wonderful outcomes that everybody, was expecting. So in terms of healthcare, in terms of education and so on, but also that it was not a stable system. It was going to be racked by extreme ups and downs. And, even some of the people who were getting a great deal of profit out of that system, weren't really in that kind of a stable situation. But certainly the people of Ireland weren't getting a whole lot out of the Celtic Tiger. Some people maybe had two jobs, and having two jobs was better than one or none. So that's probably the main thing that it did. But, the island of Ireland never had a proper healthcare system, particularly in the South, and education, they focus so much on educating engineers at university level that, the regular people who were just trying to get their kids through primary and secondary education, I think weren't well served at all. So the resources were flowing into the wrong places.
Yeah. Well, I think that's something, Dennis, that we can come back to. There's a conversation on at the minute about uniting the country, and it's very much a topic of discussion. But perhaps there's one critical view of uniting states north and south, and there's most definitely an uncritical view represented of the south as some type of a success story. And people like yourself were pointing out that was a folly long before it was recognised. But I was just thinking about your time then in West Belfast, because I know that you came back again, and that you were the chair of the West Belfast Economic Forum. I can remember as a kid listening to your radio show on Fella Radio. Maybe you want to tell us a wee bit about that and what your role was at that time, and how dynamics had changed, so certainly from the hunger strike period to a period of the peace process. Maybe you want to unpack that for us?
Yeah, we came back in 1994, and it was just really as the peace process, so-called, was being announced and so on. And, I was offered a job at Queen's in the sociology department there, and began teaching at Queen's. And, this leads directly into the topic of today, and into talking about Bobby Sands and the biography. because I think like a lot of people, I mean, there was a lot of confusion and really the outright disturbance about the peace process. I mean, what is this thing about, and what is it going to bring on? I think probably people would see me as a pessimist about a lot of things, although I'm not at heart a pessimist, really. I mean, I see a lot of hope in the future, but certainly I was concerned about the peace process and what was happening and so on, and I was trying to make sense of it basically. And one of the things that happened around 1997 was there were a lot of biographies of Che Guevara. And I was sitting here thinking, how can you make sense of what's going on in a society? And it became clear to me that biography was a terrific way to kind of get a window into a society and into social change, into political, configurations and so on. And that's really kind of what drove me to do the biography. And, I thought, well, what could you do in Ireland that hasn't been done that would actually shed light on where we're at? And, of course, probably the first thing that would have come to everybody's mind was, well, Gerry Adams. But, when you think about that and think twice, you say, well, that's probably not going to get you very far because, he's still active. There's still so much going on. But then I thought, doing a biography of Bobby Sands would be something that could really give us an insight into some important things about Northern Irish society.
I can remember you mentioned that to me, Denis. I remember you saying you picked up a John Lee Anderson book and you had those reservations. I remember us talking about this while you were in Belfast, and you said you picked up that book and you thought, could we do something like this? And at the time, perhaps inadvertently, this is a question that I found interesting. And I've mentioned this in the preface to Phil in the Carriga, was that the hunger strike period, although it was very tragic and very painful, there was a lot of emancipatory, liberatory expressions of movement organizing that went beyond, suppose, the simplistic narrative that has come out of the hunger strike, whereas all of a sudden there was a hunger strike and then a political party came out of it, and then we had the peace process. All the nuance and complexities of what went on isn't in that narrative. And I know from my own personal history, and my mother was centrally involved in the relatives action committees, and it was women who built a mass movement, and oftentimes the mainstream Republican movement were brought to that way of thinking through what was essentially a bottom up movement. So I'm wondering, is that what you were struck by, in a sense that you had this revolutionary icon who was our in, or to a much larger story?
Yeah, apart from people who really knew Bobby, I think, and particularly people in Twinbrook who kind of knew him during that 6-month period, which is all it was. When he was free, when he was out of from cage 11, and then before when he was caught again. Most people knew Bobby because he died, and they knew what he did in terms of the hunger strike and so on. I didn't know really what I would find out, but what I did find out just really amazed me, because he was at the center of what we would, a number of people now would call a kind of prefigurative movement. And what they mean when they say that is they're talking about a movement which says, well, let's not wait until we win victory in this war we're in, but let's try and create the society that we want now. We don't have to wait. We can begin doing it now. So, I begin seeing that, Bobby and his comrades, first of all, in the cages, were trying to do that. They were trying to build a society that had some meaning, that was based on principles like mutual aid instead of profit and loss and those kinds of things. And then even more so when he came into Twinbrook, the kind of social programs that they were trying to build, even in a very short period of time. And then I was just amazed by the way, under these extreme bare conditions of the blanket protest, how the prisoners were able to build a really amazing community, an amazing way of communicating, of sharing, of building a movement, through not just through the smuggling, of course, that they were able to do, but also oral communication, by building classes, by building, various other things. And to me, I was really struck by that. It seemed seemed like a new way that society could be built. Really almost a selfless society in which people are looking after the needs of each other instead of having to kind of toil and labor to, get wages to keep your family going and basically looking after yourselves. And I was just amazed by that. And, I often tell people that, I went into the project knowing how Bobby died, but the most important thing was to find out how he lived. Yeah. And, the way that not just Bobby, of course, because there were hundreds of prisoners involved in that movement, but how they worked together and really built a new kind of society. And, during the failure in August, I talked about the impact that had, for example, on American U.S. prisons. And it had a huge impact. I mean, when people read about what could be done in solitary confinement in Ireland during that period of the blanket protest leading up to the hunger strike, I mean, that had a huge impact and has really completely changed prison life in the United States from what it was, 10 or 15 years ago.
Perhaps Denis will take that there. I want to bring you back to Bobby, but now you've mentioned it, I can remember writing a blog piece a few years ago when we were in touch about the hunger strikes in Ohio prison in 2011 with those who were on death row. A fascinating story how Bobby again and the memory of Bobby was inspiring these prison activists and these abolitionists. Maybe you want to unpack that for us?
Well, I went sort of half-time. I was working at State University of New York in New York and half-time at Queen's in Belfast for a period of 4 or 5 years. And when I was doing that, I mean, I went over and was in touch with some people. There was a famous historian here, an activist called Stoughton Land, who wrote to me, and he had read the book and he shared it with Mumia Abu-Jamal, who some people may know about, a political prisoner in Pennsylvania in the US, who, is from the Black Liberation Movement. And, they started a reading group among prisoners in different state prisons in Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York. And one of the prisoners from Ohio, from Youngstown, they began to write to me, Bomani Shakur. And we began writing and then began visiting each other, just constantly. And Bomani read that book and he just, read it and read it and read it. And was fascinated by that. Now, at that point, they had been in solitary confinement since 1993. And this is about 2006, 2007. Not able to touch anybody, just in a single cell, 23 hours a day, and then doing an hour of recreation by themselves, never having any interpersonal contact whatsoever with each other, and really only able to talk to each other. And I think most people in the US who were in that situation, and there were 80,000 of them across the US in Supermax prisons that were in the same situation. And I think they felt we can't do anything about it. We're stuck here. And all we can do is, fight our case, try and get a better lawyer, try and get out of it. But, when they saw what the Irish prisoners did, first of all, that they organized a society within the prison, and they weren't really just stuck there, and they weren't by themselves. And then the way that they organized protests and then leading up to a hunger strike, they organized a hunger strike, and they did a lot of things, along the same model that was done in Ireland. They had 5 demands. They demanded that they be able to have contact with each other and have contact visits, that they could go and research their cases. There were a lot of parallels, and they learned a lot of lessons from that. And, they went on hunger strike, and everybody told them, don't do it. You're not going to get anything. And within 11 days, they won all of their 5 demands, and the state of Ohio just backed down. And that had an impact throughout the US. So, we also got in touch with some prisoners in California, which was probably the worst case of a supermax prison or isolation. These guys were in cells with a window, and they had been there for even longer. And they took the leaders. It's kind of like H6. You remember the story about how all the leaders of the blanket protests were brought together in one cell. They did the same thing in California. They brought together all of what they saw as the prison leaders. Now, there it had a little bit of a different impact, though, because these were people from the Black Guerrilla family, from La Nuestra Familia, the main Chicano group, from the Mexican Mafia, and from the Aryan Brotherhood. So they threw them all in this small corridor in a small block, kind of like a H block. And they thought they were going to fight each other and just kind of, but what they did is they organized, they talked to each other, they built community. They all read the book about Bobby Sands, and then they began to talk about what can we do about this. And they had a series of hunger strikes. At the height of the hunger strikes in California, 30,000 prisoners were on hunger strike. And through that and through the courts, they were basically able to defeat the long-term system of solitary confinement in California. And it's been on the wane throughout the US since. So, the Irish situation and experience just had a huge impact. And also in Turkey and other countries around the world.
That's fascinating, Dennis. And just I want to take it back to Bobby again, because I'm conscious here that we'll have a different age range in the group here on the call, and perhaps not everybody's aware of Bobby's contextual story. And I know you outline this really in great detail in the book in terms of growing up in Rathcoole and the making of Bobby. I know we've talked about his period in Twinbrook when he was out and his instrumental role in building the community of resistance amongst the prisoners, but perhaps just to give a sense to those who might know his background about how he came to be a revolutionary activist and how the experience of the conflict here drew them in that way.
Yeah, the way that people explained it to me, I mean, I don't want to say the way I explained it. I mean, it's in the book, but it's really because of the way that people explained what was going on to me. And, particularly people that knew Bobby over a long period of time, like Shana Walsh and people like that, Bobby grew up in a heavily Protestant neighborhood in Rathcoole. There was a minority Catholic population there. He was of a mixed family background, actually. And, but at the time, there was quite a deal of intermixing, but as a teenager, then things began to fall apart and there was a lot more sectarianism, a lot of violence. There were these tartan gangs that organized and began running around. And of course, they were hand in glove with the RUC. And so the police and the gangs that were, that were involved in sectarian violence in Rathcoole were really a basis for people like Bobby and a lot of other, nationalist youth who were kind of caught up in that situation to come together. But that wasn't, the way people have described it to me is that wasn't really a highly politically sophisticated situation. I mean, they were trying to fight against something. It was a form of oppression, and it was violence, which was directed directly at them. But there was no real political understanding of what was going on at the time. And really, what happened was when Bobby became involved in the IRA, he was involved in various kinds of robberies and things like that and got caught and was charged with possession of weapons and sent into Long Kesh. And at the time it was, in the cages. So they had these Quonset huts or Nissen huts, I think you call them there. People were self-organizing and they were reading and they were, educating each other. They were learning Irish. It was an amazing situation of people who were involved in kind of this autonomous, self-sufficient society in which, everybody was involved in a kind of mutual aid. There was also a kind of thing going on between the old guard and the new guard, because there was the old leadership of the IRA, which were much more militaristic, right-wing, sort of nationalist and anti-communist as well, or anti-Marxist. And, Bobby and the rest were reading about communism. They were reading about revolutionary movements around the world. And they were beginning to then get a consciousness of what their movement was about. It wasn't just about, the police and others attacking them and them fighting back, but it was a real political movement, which was about the liberation of society. And, then when Jerry Adams came in, things kind of intensified even more because he began to talk about Liam Mellows and some of the, people on the left in Ireland who had tried to create cooperative societies and talked about other ways of organizing. And I think that's really what impacted Bobby the most, but a number of others as well, Shayna and others as well, was this example that, you could actually set up a different kind of society. And he wrote this really amazing article in Irish about the Shaw's Road, which had just kind of begun. It was in its infancy then. And he had this idea that, you could build up an Irish-speaking society that would do its own education, its own healthcare, even have factories, and so on. And when he came out, which was in 1974 for 6 months, before he was caught again, I mean, that's basically what he was trying to do in Twinbrook, was set up that kind of a cooperative society. And the black taxis were coming out at that time, which were, really a form of cooperation. And let's do these things for ourselves instead of depending on the state to do it for us.
Well, I think that's very interesting, Dennis. That was the big thing that jumped out of the book for me. And speaking to some of the people who were there with Bobby, I know in the work that I carried out myself, Cyril McCurtain, who was their Irish speaker from Limerick, talked about the fact that this young man had a zest for music and a zest for the language, but talked about the fact that Bobby was immediately relating the language to internationalism rather than a narrow nationalism. He was linking it to anti-colonialism and the global struggle, and he was immediately unpacking that. So you talked about the famous calm, like Bonnie Keeltachta, and for him, he spoke about the fact, as you mentioned, that he quoted Mellows and says that the Gaels in the Shaw's Road were building the republic where they stood. So it was that egalitarian version of republicanism. And as you say, he brought that to Twinbrook and speak to people, like young people who come under his wing at that stage, people like Jennifer McCann, Phelan O'Hamel, and they talk about that zest that he had. Was that something that came through for you, that zest?
Oh yeah, very much.
But the armed struggle wasn't something. Perhaps this is something with a protracted armed struggle. Sometimes armed struggle can be thought of in terms of a principle rather than a tactic. But for him, the prefigurative stuff, the building an alternative society, was as important as anything that he was doing, and it was as important as the armed conflict.
Yeah,
it wasn't something that was. Yeah.
I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't want to judge him, but my feeling, from hearing the different, talking to many people about it and reading the things he wrote and that kind of a thing, is that was the thing that was most important to him. And when you talk to people like Phelan O'Hamel and others, who were with him and who were involved in that kind of movement as young people in Twinbrook, I mean, many of them would say, this is where his heart really was in building various kinds of community structures and that kind of a thing, but that he felt an obligation also to be involved in the movement, to be involved in the armed struggle, partly just out of, the principle of leadership that you can't lead by telling somebody else to do something that you're not willing to do. And that he felt a responsibility to do that as well. And so he tried to juggle those two things. I mean, Bobby, the armed revolutionary, and Bobby, the community organizer. I think he was probably a lot better at the community side of it than he was. And that showed up when he went into prison again, because he really organized things inside of the prison, along with the other blanket men, but was right at the center of that. And that's why he became a leader, was because he was so good at that kind of organizing and really of building morale, basically, by bringing people in and doing all kinds of cooperative things, as you said, all the way from music to education to smuggling, and providing food and tobacco and the good things of life.
Well, I wanted to ask you, we'll get to the hunger strike in a second, but firstly, I wanted to just, you raised that point. There's a great section in the book where you talk about him reciting the Book Trinity and the fact that I suppose, again, being farsighted in a way ahead of himself, was this idea of recognizing creativity and recognizing the arts as a key means of resistance, as a key act of resistance, and, as you said, building morals. Maybe you want to unpack that a wee bit for us, because it's something that is central to certain struggles in Latin America and struggles across the world, that the arts are central to the resistance movement.
Yeah, I think there is a special ability. I mean, I talked about Bomani Shakur in Ohio, and I'm doing an event with him next week here about a book that we've both been reading, and we're going to do an event and talk to people about the book. And Bomani is a lot like Bobby in a way, because what he has is this kind of, he's what some people would call an organic intellectual. He never had any proper education, or not that much of it. I mean, the guy was arrested in Cleveland when he was 16 years old, and basically, he was out on the streets, during his whole childhood. But he has this incredible ability to read and to figure out what's important about it and why it's good and what the lessons are and that kind of a thing, and then to relate it to others. And I think Bobby had that ability, both in terms of music, but also in terms of literature, so in poetry, for example, he could read something and kind of, get that within himself and figure out, why is this good? How can we share it? How can you also, share this in a way with other people that will help get them involved? And he was always, getting other people to write poems. Some of them were okay and some of them weren't, but, at least people were doing something. They were all involved. They were all, being a part of it. I think part of that too was him realizing that people had done that for him when he was in the cages, like Cage 11. Adams and Roon and other people that he was with in that situation had come in and brought him in and encouraged him to be what he could be, and he made the best of it. And I think what he was trying to do was do that for other people as well.
Yeah. In terms of his development, it seems, I always wanted to bring you back to the John Lee Anderson book. There's a section in the John Lee Anderson book, a chapter called Becoming Shay, and basically it talks about Ernesto, a revolutionary, but at a certain stage, at a certain time, a certain set of unique circumstances, he becomes Shay. He becomes this zealous figure where he kind of, his revolutionary activism morphs into this zealous, unrelenting commitment, the unwavering commitment to be right and to pursue that form of activism. And it seems very similar to what happens to Bobby at the end of the first hunger strike, when he, of course, is the PRO for the first hunger strike, which is called off, and he embarks on the second hunger strike. I know he's speaking to Shana whilst he's talked about this, and it's also in the book whereby he talks about his best friend morphing completely into this really serious character. He still had the crack and he still had it all, but he said something happened. The switch went, he changed, and he was completely committed to carry to the second hunger strike, of course, which would unfortunately end with his own death. So maybe you want to unpack that for us, Dennis?
Yeah, I don't know that I can unpack that because I've never been through it. I've many of us have been in situations of danger of one kind or another, but to be in that situation where you would embark on that kind of a protest where it's not even like if for example, in the armed struggle, if you're out on an operation or something like that, you could be killed, you could be wounded, or you could be caught and brought in. But this is an intentional action where over a period of time, you're going to go through, you're going to go through severe pain. You're going to be taken away and from your comrades. And, just the whole thing that was opened up in front of him is such a big thing that I'm not sure I can unpack it for you, Fergal. I think, there just are certain situations, and I think says something about the nature of the blanket protest. Severe things had come together over a period of time. Remember, it was 5 years that they were on the blanket protest before, you know, the hunger strikes, and so on. So, you know, this is something that was building up. And another thing it does say, though, and I think this is important. I've talked about a lot to Lorne Guillaume about this, is you know, when that film Hunger came out, it kind of portrayed hunger strike as an individual act of courage. And I think, you know, a lot of people had a problem with that, because a hunger strike, even though you have to do it individually, and quite often then, you know, you're taken off and kept away from everybody else, sometimes even force-fed, it's an act of solidarity. It's a collective act. It's a collective act that has to be done individually. And that's a really difficult thing to put one's head into, you know. And, you know, and as you know, many people have gone on hunger strike and haven't gone through with it all the way. And others have. And it's something beyond me to be able to explain it.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose then, Denis, to take it, that's unpacking in terms of the impact of the hunger strike in that period. Obviously, Bobby stands as elected, and then eventually, when he dies on the 5th of May, I mean, there's a carnival of reaction globally, and you have a great section in the book where you talk about this. Maybe you want to just say a few words about that, about the lessons from that period, looking at it from a historical perspective, or are you looking at it from an academic lens?
Even you know, the because the title of this, I think, is Bobby Sands and the Zapatistas. Yeah. So I mean, that can lead us into that. You know, when I read about the blanket protest and the kind of community that was being built and so on and so forth, you know, I then began to read about other campaigns, and you know, I was in Cuba for a while in the Sierra Maestra, where Che and Fidel and so on built their campaign, and I read about Che's reminiscences of the guerrilla war there, and a lot of it is about prefigurative stuff. You know, he's just absolutely fascinated about the bread, bakery that they create, or the radio station, and it's stuff like that that really has him excited. And you know, usually when we think about a guerrilla campaign, we're of course thinking about the shootouts and the victories and all that kind of stuff. But the thing really that moved a lot of that was actually coming together, organizing different kinds of things within the community, and really building a new kind of a community. And I remember reading about the Long March, Mao's Long March, and there were horrific things that happened in that. And it's not like I want to propose that we all go on a long march, and particularly not the way Mao did it. But at the same time, I mean, there was amazing solidarity, amazing community, mutual aid, people working together, building something. And, when you see, you might even compare the Long March to a hunger strike. This was an incredible, very sacrificial and at times painful and very hard thing that Mao and his people went through on this very, very long march through China before then they were able to successfully launch the revolution. And I think what it started telling me was that even in movements that see themselves primarily as a Marxist Leninist movement or a guerrilla movement or whatever, that these kinds of prefigurative things about building society among ourselves now take hold. They become very, very, very important. And, the Zapatista movement is a movement where that has been right at the center of it. I mean, it's a movement that, they claim to be an armed movement, and they had this little uprising that happened in 1994, at the beginning of 1994. But, it wasn't long-lived. People did die. They took over territory, and much of that territory they've held since that time, and particularly large amounts of territory in the jungle, the Lacandon jungle in the southeast of Mexico. But since the ceasefire at the end of the uprising in 1994, there has not been a single shot fired. The EZLN, the Zapatista army, has continued. They train, they're well armed, You know, they enforce the territory and so on and protect it, particularly against things like drug runners and so on, which are trying to come through that bit of the territory. But the main thing that they're involved in is building a new kind of a society, much of which is based on Mayan principles. I mean, they have, you know, they've chosen to exit the Mexican society as Mao chose to exit and go on the Long March, or as Che and Fidel chose to exit and go into the Sierra Maestra. But, you know, they've exited and then they've built a new society. And I think the difference between the Zapatistas and others is that that was their main goal, is to build a new kind of society. And you've probably heard this phrase, another world is possible. And that's the kind of thing which has come out of the Zapatistas. So they have, you know, these principles like, they have a principle of leaders, several principles of leadership, but the main one is a thing called mandar obedeciendo, which is to lead by obeying. And it's about, you know, we do the will of the people. And that comes right out of Mayan civilization, where people are given a charge. And the way you become a respected member of the community is by the community charges you with something. They tell you, you know, this is what your project is to do now. And you do that and you do it well. And the Mayans in that area have hats that have these ribbons hanging from them. And the most respected people have more ribbons, and every one of those ribbon is a charge that was put to them by the community. So they've become leaders by obeying the community, by doing what is asked of them by the community. And that's really the main principle of Zapatismo, of the Zapatistas as well. So what they've done is taken those elements, I think, that you see in every revolutionary movement, and that we've talked about in the case of the blanket protest as well, the building of the movement inside, you know, inside the H blocks. But they've taken it to a higher level, basically, and they really tried to build this society. You know, when I lived there for a period of time back.
I was going to ask you about that, Dennis, to unpack the thing that you stayed with him. You were with him.
Yeah, I lived there in 2003 and 2004. I'm still in the 19th century. I'm or the 20th century. 23 and 24, which was the 10th anniversary of their uprising, and they had been living in these autonomous communities, self-governed communities, for 10 years, and they were kind of celebrating the fact that they had been able, you know, not just to survive, but to grow and to build over that period of time. They had built their own healthcare system. They had built their own educational system. You know, I stayed for a while in what was called the Secundaria, which was to train school teachers. And there were school teachers from all over Chiapas, the state where the Zapatistas are based. And I remember going to classes that were taught by these young Tzotzil, Celtal, other Mayans from different parts of the Mayan community. And Spanish was their second language. Their first language was, you know, a Mayan language. Yet they were able to talk about, for example, the international monetary system in a way that would have, I think, embarrassed most of the professors I know, economics professors. You know, they knew it so well, but they knew it from below. You know, they had learned through the experience of grassroots understanding of poverty and what had been done to them by the international monetary system. So, you know, they were building this really incredible community that was doing all of these things to try and make it a better society, and particularly in the light of, you know, the abuse really that the Mayans had to suffer, and the dispossession of land, going back to the land acknowledgement statement that I made at the beginning of our conversation. You know, they had massive ranches taken away from them, and the reason they rose was because Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, which came after the Mexican Revolution, gave the right of indigenous people to create collective areas, ejidos they're called, and they're basically collective self-governed areas, and that was being taken away. by, through the North American Free Trade Agreement and other things that were happening in 1994. And they rose up against that because they said, we have the right to rule ourselves, to organize ourselves. And, many of them went into the jungle, basically, and they began to organize, including Subcomandante Marcos, who was really from Puebla outside of Mexico City, but, went and joined them and, became, an important part of that movement.
I think, Denis, it was interesting when we spoke a few weeks back, how the story of Bobby, in a sense, and the story of the Zapatistas help shape your own ideological formations, because sometimes a lot of us would come from the traditional left, Marxist-Leninist left, and there would be a critique of that level of how people like the Zapatistas, those types of movements were letting capitalism off the hook. This idea that you can change the world by taking power is really a cop-out. And obviously, I know from your experience that this kind of went the other way, that through your experience, you were then drawn away from, I suppose, the expansion of politics brought you towards this more anarchist way of viewing things. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, it would be, whatever we call it. I mean, I think and it's really what I found out on reflecting about the experience. And part of it was that I did the final edits of the Bobby Sands biography when I was living in Oventique, which is an autonomous Zapatista community. And I lived there for a while. And, in the day I was learning Spanish and talking Spanish and doing that kind of thing. And at night I was, editing this huge manuscript, which, I think it was twice as big when I started as the final book when it came out.
Yeah.
And, that had a big impact in looking about what was happening with the Zapatistas and what they were doing, and reflecting then about, what the blanket men had been doing in the jail, or the women in Armagh as well. It made me rethink what it was that I had been hearing from the prisoners that I was talking to and from others. And there were some other things that were very important in that as well. And one of the most important things was the idea of restorative justice. And this, I was told by Zapatistas, was the main reason why they weren't able to make peace. There were peace accords with the Mexican government, and those fell apart. They never came to fruition. But I was told one of the main reasons was because they insisted on having their own justice system, and that system had to be based on restorative justice, not on retributive justice, not on punishment. And, that had a huge impact on me. I mean, especially after, all of the years of living in West Belfast, the kneecapping and all of the other kinds of things. I mean, there was a lot of punishment going on, both by the state and also by the movement. And to think, that you could build a society that, turned its back on that kind of way of thinking about justice. And, I've been, happy to see the way that ideas of restorative justice have kind of taken hold in, the nationalist communities around the North since that period of time. I think it's an extremely important thing. And it was something I had never really considered, but a lesson that I learned from them, from the Zapatistas.
Well, Denis, this is a bit of fun. Me and you could talk about this all night, but I'm conscious that we'll have the guts of 35 very, very articulate, opinionated folks who would like to come in, probably ask the question themselves, perhaps make a comment. So I'm happy to hand it over to Orla to chair that. If people want to come in and ask Denis a question or make a comment. Any volunteers to start off?
Agus ta fedrat an go live na question current the chat box. Come on, so if anybody hasn't got a microphone function and wants to add their question into the chat box, that's grand. I'll read it out.
Hey Fergal, Denis, it's so lovely to hear your familiar voice again. It was just such a pleasure listening to you there. And I mean, thanks very much to Glór na Móna and to Fergal for organising this again. This is something that me and my sisters really enjoy every year. And I think especially this year, Denis, your familiar voice is just so comforting. I really enjoy that. And listen, Denis, you actually triggered a nice wee memory for me. My daddy was holding forth one time about to me and my partner about the property bubble in Dublin and how it was going to collapse. And we were like, oh yeah. And he was going into this detail and trying to explain how we shouldn't put a deposit down on a house. This is going back years. And we were like, oh yeah, okay. So we didn't end up putting our deposit down on a house. And of course it all crashed then. And I was thinking, how did he know this? You know, he was really, really wise. And now, of course, I realized that he was talking to you about it because you're the expert.
I wouldn't go that far because, I mean, he had his own mind, you know, and I think probably figured it out himself as well.
Yeah, it was good advice anyway. So we saved up for 13 years and we got our wee house in Dublin at a good price. So it all worked out okay.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And
I'm
so
glad to hear we've done something right.
Yeah, and I'm working in the Palestinian embassy now in Dublin, Denis, and I noticed a lot of parallels with what you were saying there about, you know, what happened in Belfast and also in America. And actually, a couple of the points there that were really interesting about, you know, resistance through art, which is the Palestinians are. They do have a lot of that. I mean, their flag was banned, so they had to think of ways to use the colours to represent themselves and their culture, you know. And then, of course, the hunger strikes as well. There's actually 6 Palestinians on hunger strike at the minute. And one of them has been surviving on diorite for, you know, it's going to be on day 100 tomorrow. And I see the pictures of him every day. It's very striking that it's kind of an act of resistance when you have nothing left to fight with, is to use your own body to try to make a political statement and to fight for the rights of others, you know. So it was great listening to you there, Denis, and enjoying those parallels, and thanks again for organizing this Fergal. Every year is so interesting for us, and it's, you know, it's something we enjoy because we don't have that father figure to, you know, give us the lectures and enlighten us on current affairs. So we'll love catching up and listening. Thanks so much, Denis, and it's lovely to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too. You know, I mean, some years have gone by, but you know, I still remember those days in Norfolk Drive, and you know, and of course, fire around the corner, and you know, people here and there. You know, those were very good times. But yeah, you know, what you're saying, I think is very important. Some of those parallels, you know, and I've met now hunger strikers, you know, from Turkey, from Palestine, from many other places around the world. And, you know, I think also they've learned a lot from what happened in Ireland. I mean, you know, the Irish hunger strikers lasted, you know, maybe 60 days. And you know, I hate to refer it this way, but the technology of hunger strike, you know, has changed tremendously. So some of the Turkish hunger strikers, you know, would last hundreds of days. And as a means of putting pressure on the state, I mean, I think it's been important. But the other thing that I think is really important, both in Palestine and in Turkey, is the way that the state leadership, or the leadership of the movement that people had trust in, basically turned their back on them and didn't provide for them. So Hamas got strength in Palestine because, you know, the Palestinian Authority basically didn't provide the things that people required, that they had to have. And in Turkey, I mean, here was this, you know, wonderful secular state, you know, built by Ataturk. And, you know, over time, they just didn't provide housing. They didn't provide education. They didn't provide food and medical care. And, you know, the people turn on the state that just refuses or doesn't, you know, provide these kinds of things. And they can either go with a progressive movement, or they can go with, you know, a really regressive, you know, government like the current government of Turkey, which is just, you know, well, I'll not use the word fascist because it's overused, but a real reactionary government. And, you know, those are the kinds of things that can happen. So I think it is important for movements to really pay attention to, you know, the demands of the people. And this idea of leading by obeying, I think it's extremely important. So thank you for those comments. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Sarah. Kieran McGillivant, screen session running into chat. He's written something in the chat, but I don't think you finished what you wanted to say, or maybe you want to jump on.
Or just threw me in there and so I actually had it by mistake while I was driving the bloody question and get caught, so forced into saying it now instead of typing it. But Graham, Dennis, that was a really fascinating.
Kieran, good to see you again.
It was excellent. Thanks very much.
Good to hear you.
It was really excellent contribution and talking there. I found it really, really fascinating. It was interrupted now and again by the kids coming down the stairs and we had no put them back up in bed. So hopefully, if you've covered this at all, apologies. But I just wanted to ask you in terms of the Zapatista movement. Obviously, there's been an election of a more leftist government in Mexico, and has that changed the nature of the relationship between that movement and the government or the state per se, or has it remained the same? Are they still completely kind of cut off from the state or operating their own separate society?
No, I mean, I think that it hasn't changed things fundamentally. And, you know, a lot of people have been, I think, pretty critical and saddened by actually the lack of leadership of AMLO and of the new government in Mexico. I mean, there was great potential when that government came in. Now we know mostly. I mean, if I walked out my door here where I'm at in my office, I could be in Mexico in 5 minutes. I mean, we're that close to the border. Well, I'd have to climb over a wall. But so we know a lot about, the kinds of ways in which that government kind of went into almost a coalition with Trump to do some really horrific things to people at the border. And, it's an example, I think, of how what seems like a progressive and a leftist movement can go bad or do a lot of things that are not so good. In terms of the Zapatistas, my understanding, but I think we'll have the opportunity in a couple of days to meet with and hear a delegation of women from the Zapatistas who came over in a boat from Mexico. They floated a boat to Spain and I think are going around Europe, and you can get a better idea of kind of what's going on now. I think, the main thing that has struck me over the years is really the resiliency. And this is a word you always hear when you hear about indigenous societies generally, but particularly about indigenous movements, indigenous women's movements, is the word resiliency and the way that they are able to sort of overcome the most horrific things that you could imagine. And, the Zapatistas, I always thought from the very beginning that they were just so fragile. And I thought, no, how could these people possibly exist, for more than months, if at best years. And now, they're going almost into their third decade. And it's really, pretty amazing that they have been able to maintain themselves. I think, the new government has probably at least given them a little bit more elbow room so that, they're not right on top of them in the way that previous governments weren't. But, when AMLO first ran for president 6 years ago, the Zapatistas didn't back him. They came out and they explicitly said that this is not the way we think you're going to build a new society. And there was a real split within the progressive sectors in Mexico about that, some of whom sided with the Zapatistas, some of whom sided with AMLO and with his party. So it's a kind of difficult and complex situation. But I encourage people to go hear what the women ambassadors from the Zapatistas have to say in a couple of days. I wish I could be with you. Maybe I'll jump on a plane and get there.
Or perhaps I'm almost sure that Linda Sullivan's in the house here, because Linda wanted to plug that now that Denis has mentioned it, and I thought this was amazing. I'm away next week, unfortunately, and I won't be here for the visit. But the Irish language community comes to the rescue when the Zapatista movement comes here. I'm looking for a place to host them. It's the Calderland and Common Clonard that's going to be doing the hosting. Is Linda here?
I can't see her.
I'm here.
Go right.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Gara Margaret. Yeah, so we have the honor of hosting a delegation of 7 Zapatista women. I'm traveling down to Dublin tomorrow to collect them, and we have a couple of days in the Sperrins with the communities resisting extractivism there. Actually, communities from across the island are coming together at the weekend to have a conversation with them and talk about like local autonomous governance. And then we'll be in Belfast on the 26th. And as Fergal said, the Culturland and Common Clonard's hosting us. So we're starting at 8:30 at Radio Falcha. And we're doing like a walking tour for an hour, and then we're starting at 10 at the Culturland. And then in the evening, well, so it'll be 10 to 3, an all day conversation, because it's about like, you know, deep dialogue, and it's not just a couple of hours. Like, so if you can't make it for the whole day, if you're coming, that would be great. And then we want, like, this is the last day of their Ireland tour. So they've been on the island for 11 days now. And then after they're with us, they'll be heading over to Scotland. So we'll be sending them off in style with Irish music and poetry at the Clonard at 7. So if any is our poets or singers, please get in touch and share a song or a poem with them. It would be great if you are coming to send me your name and what, like, I don't know, what your group you're with or what you're involved in, just because with numbers and restrictions, and we need to know who's going to be there. It's not a public event. They specifically asked for no public events. They just want to make grassroots groups and local movements. And they won't be engaging with any like interviews or media. So if you want to hear them, yeah, 26th is the time to do it.
Okay.
I'll just put my email in the chat.
Oh my goodness, thank you. To Kirsten Shaw, Ursula has left a question because the Bobby's sleeping. So how do you think Irish revolutionaries today should be using their energies to affect change in Irish society, and how can those energies be more effective?
Yeah, Linda reminded me of something, and it goes back to a question or a comment before, I think, that Fergal made about music and culture and so on, and its importance and struggle. And one of the things that you know, in the work I've been doing around this subject, following on studying, you know, and living with Zapatistas and so on, is that, you know, one thing that people can do is kind of leave society and create a new kind of a society. But the other thing that we can do is to begin to recognize those parts of our lives that really are what we call exilic. They are parts of our lives that aren't governed by profit and loss, basically, by the laws of capitalism. And frankly, most of our lives are that way. Most of our lives are not governed by capitalism. They're mostly governed by mutual aid, by our interactions and cooperations with each other. And we've tried to talk about a new way of thinking about value, for example. And this goes back to the word work. You know, in German, there are 2 words for work, opus and Arbeit. We only use 1 word for work, but opus is about creation and Arbeit is about toil and sort of slaving around at stuff that you don't really want to do. And I think it's important that we begin to recognize those 2 different aspects of what work is about. And yes, we do have to do things that we don't want to do, but we also do a lot in our lives that we do it because we want to do it. And unfortunately, what capitalism has done through wages and money and all that kind of thing has put value on the things that we don't want to do, on often things that are less important for society. Whereas, you know, it's important that we begin to recognize and value those activities that we do, whether we're getting paid for them or not. You know, and many of those are things like singing, dancing, making music, doing sport together. You know, all of the things that we put under the name culture are things that we actually do because they help us to do, and what we like to use this phrase, the work of building community. That's work, but it isn't recognized as work, and it's not recognized as something that has monetary value, and therefore it gets devalued in the way that we think. So I think, you know, one of the first things that we need to do is to rethink what we consider to be valuable in society. And the most valuable things we do are the ways that we work together to build community. It's not, you know, building a bicycle or a Tesla or, you know, or a television or whatever. It's actually working together to build community. And, you know, scientists have looked at in neurosciences, they're, you know, discovering so much more about the way people's brains work and so on. And what they've discovered is that music and dance actually opens up new parts of the brain that open one up to your interactions with your fellow people, and which, you know, help to create community. And so community is actually created through those kinds of activities, rather than through the forced activities that we do in a factory or an office or whatever. So I think that that's very important, is just to think, how can we increase the things that we do for each other, you know, while, you know, keeping ourselves, you know, alive and keeping body and soul together and putting food on the family, as George W. Bush used to say. But, you know, what we really need to value is what we do for each other. And the society is trying to impose, you know, ideas of individualism and possessiveness and competition on us. And the important thing is to resist that by living our lives in a cooperative way in which we have solidarity and we help each other. And I think that's one of the most simple things that we can do to try and make our lives and our societies better. And then build organizations that do those things, build groups, you know, that have, in that way, that have the ability to keep going over a period of time.
Or do I? To be Ella, folks. To be any more questions? I saw a hand up there a minute ago, but it's down now. But to be
Dennis, can I ask you one more question? Sorry for holding this. If nobody's coming in, are you looking in? I would disagree, Shaq, Maeve?
Yes, go around, Maeve. Maeve, you're on mute. That's you.
Oh yeah, that's me now. How you, Dennis?
I know. That's the mute, man. The mute gets us every time.
I know. I have it on mute in case any of the kids come in yelling obscenities.
Great to see you again.
I know, great to see you too, Dennis. I was just thinking there, laughing when before you even moved into the house, you had just bought that house and you were moving in, but just hadn't moved in yet. And one of the kids in the street said, "Here, there's communists moving in there." Said to my Daddy, apparently there's a communist moving in. What's that? And Daddy was said, "Who said that?" And I went, "Such and such up the street." And he went, he's laughing his head off, and he went, "Tell him there's already one here in 3 Norfolk Drive."
That's great. I love that.
I know. But I was just really interested in the Mayan community. I've actually never heard of them, being a bit ignorant. But and I know how, being from West Belfast, we love a good kneecapping. So I'm just wondering how the Mayan community, you were saying they don't do punishment. What is their restorative justice? Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this quite a lot when I was there, you know, and they have an idea which is called buen pensamiento, which is right thinking. And they said, in order to be a part of our community, you have to be a right-thinking person. And I said to them, well, what does that mean? How do you know if somebody's right-thinking? And they said, well, they're here. And it begins with just the idea that, you know, those who choose to be a part of our community. Now, and in this case, it's a little bit different than from West Belfast, for example, because, you know, you didn't have a choice to be born on Norfolk Drive and grow up there and all that kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
But these are people who have either been kicked out of where they were or who have voluntarily moved into that community. So for them, it's more of you know, it's easier to have a trusting relationship with each other because you know you know that you all have made that choice to be there. But then people do things that are not right, you know, and there have been very few, but some occasions of people being exiled from the community. But, you know, the one thing that they would say is that if you ask us to do something, or if you want to do something in the community, our first answer is always yes. And then we think about why we might not want to do that. But the first answer is always yes. So I think there's a level of trust that's built up within the community, that there's an idea that if somebody wants to do something, yeah, let's see how it works out.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work out so well, then, you know, let's go off and do something else. But, you know, then the other thing is, I mean, and this goes back, and maybe there's an advantage in a lot of indigenous societies, because many of them do have these kind of traditions or ways of exercising justice, that if somebody killed your husband, they would then be responsible for coming in and taking care of you and restoring what had been lost. And, you know, so, I mean, putting them in jail would be seen as, you know, something that it just has no meaning to them. All you're doing is fighting twice when you do that. And so there's a responsibility that if you do something bad to someone else, you need to restore that thing to them.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult thing, I think, for a lot of us to get our heads around.
I know. But I just say a community of like-minded people, like making a choice to live a certain way, like we'd reduce people like that being there. I know.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. You know, and we saw that, as you more than anyone knows, coming out of the struggle. I mean, you know, it was a society that was in kind of, you know, Durkheim, the sociologist, called it anomie. You know, when social rules don't make a whole lot of sense, and people are having a hard time figuring out, you know, what they are, and then you get a lot of people that, you know, wouldn't have been acceptable, you know, in other times. And, you know, those are the really, really hard times. Yeah. And I don't have an answer for you how you get out of that. Although I do think that the various attempts at saying restorative justice, you know, I know about some in Twin Brook and Polglass and so on, have been, you know, a good thing.
There's another wee question here in the chat box from Dr. Michael Liggett. What size is the Zapatista population?
They are, well, actually, I mean, that's hard to say, partly because they have 7 autonomous communities, and the autonomous communities would have, you know, hundreds living in them. But then there are Zapatistas all throughout, not just the state of Chiapas, but Tabasco and some other states in the southeast of Mexico. And in fact, some people would say there are Zapatistas all over Mexico, and even in other parts of the world, because there are many people who are following Zapatista ways of organizing, ways of living, of making community. So it's a little bit difficult, but I mean, you know, we're talking about tens of thousands who are kind of the core of the Zapatista population. And then there are a number of communities of what they call municipios, of towns or villages around the state of Chiapas, where most of Zapatismo is, that have dual governments. So there's one called San Andres where I spent some time, and you know, there's a Zapatista government and there's a Mexican government of that community. And the Zapatistas run the plaza, and they run the street cleaning and the toilets and, you know, a few other things. And then the state ones run the electricity, and they run some other stuff, you know. So there's a lot of that going on, and therefore it's difficult to say, you know, who is a Zapatista and who isn't. It's kind of like the SDLP and Sinn Féin at one time, you know, or, you know, people who were in the IRA and they voted for the SDLP, you know, what were they? We knew a lot of people like that, right?
Okay. Kestjarnak.
Again, apologies for hogging this to Dennis, but we spoke about this with Robbie McVeigh there during the week. And again, when myself and yourself chatted a few weeks back on Zoom, you were asking me about the current situation. We spoke about Brexit. We spoke about the fact that the Northern State gladly is falling apart in front of us. And the debate at the minute is what type of Ireland is it going to be? And when it comes to the issue of the Irish unity, it's more of a when, not if at the minute. And I would just like to hear your take on this, because some of us have been arguing that the issue of class is missing from the conversation. This idea you're going to unite states, and we had a counter-revolution in Ireland where you had people like the devil era saying Labour can wait. You know what I mean? It's okay, we'll get you in Ireland, then don't worry about that. We'll sort it out in our time. Yeah. So I just want to know what you think about that as somebody who's looking at it from afar.
Yeah, well, I mean,
someone who lived here, obviously.
It's always the temptation to kind of take what you can get, and worry about getting the other things later on when you can get them. We're going through it right now with Joe Biden and his Build Back Better. I don't know if you've heard about this thing, but he wants to spend. Well, the progressives among the Democratic Party want to spend $3.5 trillion on really good social projects and on things that have to do with green energy and all kinds of stuff like that. And others say, no, all we can do is spend $1 trillion and wait and we'll do the other stuff later. And, politics always, there's that old saying, what is it? Politics is the art of the possible. On the other hand, Che Guevara said, let's be realistic and dream the impossible. So, I think we're fighting a war between those two things. I'm more on the side of attempting the impossible, frankly, because I think, the more that we do it, even if you look at the rise of capitalism, it rose hundreds of times before it finally became a viable system. So capitalism didn't just all of a sudden become capitalism and we went from feudalism to capitalism. It came up in different ways in different places and so on. And I think that's the lesson that we also have to have for progressive change, is that we have to continue pushing for the kind of society that we want to have. So, speed the day when there's a united Ireland, and then we can put that aside, and then, and we will, maybe everybody will start working on the issue about how do we build a better society. And they already are, but those of us who care about those things just have to keep banging at the message. We have to keep saying, well, fine, you can get your political or national solution, but that's really not going to change things. And again, going back to Turkey and Palestine, those are examples. They got their state, but, or state-led. But what good has it done? Because they don't provide what is needed for the population.